Brought to you by concordiatheology.org, bringing you resources that support the vigorous life of the mind in service of the gospel of Christ.
Welcome to Lectionary Kickstart. We're sparking your thoughts for Sunday as you plan your sermon or teaching lesson. I'm your host and producer, Jessica Bordolo, here with Dr. David Schmidt and Dr. Peter Napsker. They're both professors of homiletics here at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. You can hear all about us in our introductory episode, but trust me, they are pretty good preachers. Okay, let's get started. Peter, where are we in the church year?
We are in the third Sunday after Pentecost as we celebrate the Spirit alive in the church for the sake of the world.
And David, what are the texts this week?
The texts are 1 Kings 19, Galatians 5, Luke 9, and Psalm 16.
As always, I ask each of you to tell me which text you would choose to preach about. To determine who goes first this week, our Old Testament reading, the Lord is speaking to Elijah, and he didn't come in the earthquake or fire. He came in a small, low whisper, right? Earthquake, fire, wind. What's the worst storm you've ever been in?
We were camping up in the Boundary Waters a number of summers ago, and we only brought hammocks because the weather report said that all 3 nights were going to be beautiful. And so I thought my family and I would sleep underneath the stars.
Cool.
And the first 2 nights were beautiful. And the third night, the heavens unloaded. And we were able to squeeze our kids into tents with some friends that were with us. And Katie and I slept in hammocks through the storm. And it rained all night. We were soaking. It was the worst night. And lightning around us. We were terrified. It was awful.
Wow. That's crazy.
Well, for me, it was when I was in the Philippines teaching, and I was going back from Baguio City to Manila, and there was a monsoon, and so I couldn't take the plane flight. So I took a bus from Baguio City to Manila, and the monsoon had flooded the North Luzon Plain, and so the bus came to the edge of the flooding and sat there. Nobody speaks English. I don't have a cell phone. This is before cell phones. No one knows that my travel plans had changed. I didn't know what was going on. I'm like, okay, so this is where I go. And then another bus pulled up on the other side, and the 2 drivers walked and met each other in the middle of the flooded plain and figured out that they could walk over. So we got our luggage and walked through the flood, got on the other bus, and drove down to Manila. So that was the worst, probably the worst I've been.
That is crazy.
Wow.
So earlier this spring, there were some tornadoes that went through St. Louis. I was here in the seminary, and I went in the basement, and then 20 minutes later we came out, and Concordia campus did not look the same, and it still doesn't. Trees down, branches down, so that was crazy. Both of your stories are awesome, but being in a foreign country with a storm, that sounds more terrifying. So, David, you win. You get to go first.
Okay, great. Well, I would preach on the text you used, the 1 Kings text. That's the one that I would choose to preach on. And particularly, Jessica, if you could read verses 11 through 15.
And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' And he said, 'I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I, only am left. And they seek my life to take it away.' And the Lord said to him, 'Go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus.'"
Okay, and then God gives some directions on what to do. I love this reading because of the parallelism that is in it. The reading begins with Elijah going to this cave. The Lord comes to him and asks him a question, "What are you doing here?" And he has this whole list of grievances.
That's legit. I would do that.
Right.
Totally.
So it's a great example of prayer, just letting God read your heart and telling God what's going on. he's on the mountain, and then he has this mighty wind, he has this earthquake, he has this fire, and he has this whisper. And then we have the same conversation that we had in the very beginning. The events of the wind, the earthquake, and the flame, those events are bracketed by two conversations with God. And then God gives him commands, not to go onto the mountain, but to actually go and anoint people to be a prophet and to trust that the Lord has people reserved in Israel that honor his name. And so you've got this question that arises: what did this series of events change? What did it do? What did God reveal in this series of events that would prepare Elijah for having the exact same feelings about his life experience, but now going out and doing the work of the Lord? Something that there had to be something revealed in that. And so where is the Lord? Well, the Lord is in a whisper. The power of God is found in a whisper. And that then equips Elijah to trust in the way God works, that God shows his power in his presence, which can be as quiet as a whisper. And so when Elijah goes on, so for me, this is I would kind of work with a paradox-maintained sermon on this one. Mm-hmm. That the paradox is that God is a God of powerful weakness. That we have a God and his weakness is his power. This is what the Apostle Paul confesses, that my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made known in my weakness. So with a paradox-maintained sermon, you've got that paradox, which is the reality of the way in which God is working. We can overemphasize the weakness, and when we overemphasize the weakness, we're led into despair. We're led to say something like Elijah saying, I alone am left.
So what's that look like? What's it look like to? Can you think? Do you have an example in mind of
I think
overemphasizing the weakness?
Well, yeah. You've got the biblical examples, of the Apostle Paul and the thorn in the flesh that was besetting him, mm-hmm. and the weakness. The weakness of God is more powerful than man's strength. But you think about your own life experience and. The areas in your life where you are bearing the cross, where you are recognizing that this is the end of your strength. This is the end of your wisdom, that this child you have, trying to raise this child in the faith, you are watching the end of everything that you have decided was going to work, and you have nothing left, and you're at the end of your rope, and there's nothing left to hold on to, and you realize that God's holding on to you, right? That there's going to be, the power of God is going to be made manifest in that moment of weakness. And so you've got these questions of, when we're confronted with this apparent weakness of God, we're called to remember that our God is a God of powerful weakness. In these moments of the cross, in these moments of weakness, God displays his power. What's more weak than a dead king on a cross?
Right.
And yet that's the power of God.
What I like about this is it allows you to take seriously the cross as a sign of weakness. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, there's some scripture passages that talk about the cross as victory and its power, and that's true. That's one way to look at it. But it sure did look weak when you've got Jesus suffering and dying, the one who, if he saved himself, or if he saved others, why can't he save himself?
Right.
That's weakness. That's suffering. And this allows you to take that seriously as suffering. You don't just run to the kind of the view that God is conquering sin and death there. You take it seriously. Mm-hmm. Well, and this is what I think the value and the beauty of the paradox-maintained approach to a sermon is that you affirm both truths, mm-hmm. even though they're contradictory. Is God weak or is he powerful?
Well, he's a God of powerful weakness.
Both. He is weak and he is powerful. They're both true.
Right. In a paradox-maintained sermon, the first thing you explore is what happens if we overemphasize weakness. If we overemphasize weakness, forget about the power, we tend toward despair, and I'd kind of phrase that as I alone am left. If we overemphasize the power, and underemphasize the weakness, I think then we're tempted not toward despair, but we're tempted toward independence. I alone am enough. Right? If I overemphasize the power and I act as if God isn't going to work in the weak places of my life, God only is found in these powerful places in my life, then I become very independent, almost independent of God. That I alone am enough. That's all I need. You take people from the overemphasis on power to the recognition that you aren't independent.
Yeah.
You cannot be independent of God, and it's not going to work.
Right. So the I'm not alone highlights the power of God, and the it's enough kind of highlights that this weakness is enough.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's a helpful way to, I mean, that captures the Christian life, right? The Christian existence is this paradox where we believe and confess that I believe in God the Father Almighty.
Right.
And who for us and came down from heaven and was made incarnate and made very weak. And so this kind of is a big picture.
Died.
Yeah, suffered
Right.
and died.
Yeah.
And so this helps kind of frame the way people think about who God is and in their lives, how he acts.
Yeah.
I think it would be helpful for you to give the explanation that you gave to me, that he's choosing to clothe or to cloak his power and might. Because if I only listened to part of your sermon and I just heard you say that God is weak, I might not understand that he's weak by choice. You know, that he's choosing to clothe himself in flesh. He's choosing to let himself die. It's not because it was done to him, right? Jesus gave up his life. So that might be helpful because I might just hear that part.
Okay. Yeah.
I
That's where in the creed, who for us and for our salvation came down from heaven and was made incarnate. And so it's kind of this gracious, he makes himself weak for us.
Great. Thank you, David. What about you, Peter? What would you preach about?
Well, interestingly enough, I did not choose to preach on 1 Kings, but I did think I would go with a paradox maintained structure.
You're kidding me.
No, I did.
Oh my gosh.
I love that
it.
structure. I think it's a great.
I love it. Well, there are so many paradoxes, and we
Yeah.
get so screwed up.
Right.
Because they sound contradictory. And we're like, we want to fix them. And if we try to fix them, we end up.
And ironically, even as Lutherans, we love paradoxes in theory.
Right.
But when actually living them out, they're not always pleasant to live out in practice.
Not good.
So I want to put a plug in just for a second, because I know David wouldn't do this. On concordiatheology.org, if you drop down, there's 4 or 5 different sub-tabs, and one of them is sermon structures, and it's all of David's work on sermon structures, and one of them is the paradox maintained structure. You can go read about that structure. You can, I think, listen to a sermon example. But that, if you listeners haven't looked at that site and the sermon structures stuff that David's put together, I just told him, I'm sorry, I'm just being overly kind to you today, Dave. I just told
paradox maintained? Are you going to be mean to him?
I was
as
telling,
well?
no, there's no meanness here. I was telling some of my students just the last day of class, I was pointing them to this website, and I said, David has done work on sermon structures that no homiletician is doing in terms of helping people think through how you organized, giving concrete examples. It's a beautiful resource. So check it out. That's usually, Jessica, your job.
Absolutely. I have a binder of sermon structure text that David wrote. It's like the textbook for his class. It's sitting on my desk right there. It's like 2 inches thick. It looks amazing.
Okay, so when do I pay you guys?
You know where I live, and you know I like apple pie.
That's true.
So paradox maintained, but this one I'm going to draw out of the Galatians text. And the Galatians 5 text, I would call it the freedom conundrum or the freedom paradox or something along those lines. And I was just noting that, coming up this week is
4th of July.
4th of July, right? And 4th of July, of course, is celebration of freedom. And but I actually want to have a reflection on freedom. I want to celebrate the 4th of July like a Lutheran by having, and you're gonna laugh at this, having Reformation come early this year in July.
Oh my
Okay,
gosh.
so you're gonna go Reformation in July, and here's why.
You're going to upset everybody.
I actually think there's a really good reason to focus on Luther, and to focus on July 4th through this text, Galatians 5.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, the beauty of this is that the people are living in the world of the July 4th.
Yes.
And what you're doing is you're answering that question that they may not even be asking, which is, how do I, as a Christian, live and learn in this context?
And this is central. This text is central to the Reformation, even more central than we probably realize, because every time we celebrate Reformation on October 31st, we're usually going with a certain set of standard texts that don't usually highlight what this text highlights. So would you start by reading the first couple verses, Galatians 5:1, and then also 13 and 14?
For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself.
Okay. The reason I'd want to focus on the Reformation is among the concepts of the Reformation, we always talk about salvation by grace through faith, and
Right.
that's so important and so central. But if in 1520, right after Luther was kind of gaining steam and he was starting to cause trouble in the church because he was bringing the gospel back in, he wrote 3 really important treatises in 1520. And the last of them is a treatise called On the Freedom of a Christian Man. And what he did in there is he proclaimed and described the paradox of the Christian life. And it was all a paradox around freedom. Mm-hmm. And so it seems to me, at least, that when you're thinking about freedom as Americans, there's a way we can say, okay, we're all thinking about freedom here. Let's think about freedom from a Christian perspective, and Luther really helps us with that.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, in America, we tend to think of freedom as freedom to do whatever I want.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And that's that. I mean, this is we toggle back and forth. The paradox, we dissolve it on both sides.
Right.
And one of them is a temptation, like you just described, that we'll get to in a second here. But Luther summarizes this whole treatise with 2 statements. They're pretty familiar to a lot of people who've studied Luther. A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. Okay, so what does it mean to be a Christian? I'm totally free. Nobody tells me what to do. What does it mean to be a Christian? I am a servant of everyone. I am bound to all. And that Luther unpacks in this treatise. I was just reading a little bit about the treatise, which is interesting. If I understood it correctly, the first 2 big treatises he wrote in 1520 were in Latin, but he wrote this one in Latin and German because it was so useful and practical to normal people. I think that's the case. You'd have to look it up for sure. And then I would explore both sides of the paradox. A Christian is perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. That's pure gospel. We are free. We are not bound by the law. This is what Paul gets at in this reading from Galatians, that we are no longer kept, guarded, kind of burdened by the law. We are set free from the law by Jesus, his life, death, resurrection, and that frees us completely. When I think about the freedom of the gospel, I think it's hard for me sometimes to appreciate the freedom of the gospel because I've always lived in it. Mm-hmm. I was baptized at a couple weeks old. I've never known an existence where I didn't know the forgiving love of God in Christ. And so if I were going to try to capture and understand the freedom that is experienced by those who've been under the burden of the law, I think I would probably have some conversations this week with members that I know who are adult converts from religions or confessions that are more legalistic. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes you talk to somebody who's come out of a legalistic context, and their appreciation for the freedom of the gospel always impressed me and kind of shamed me because I just didn't relate as much. So I can think of a couple people I would say, hey, can you tell me about what it was like when you understood the gospel and the freedom that comes with. And who knows what stories your members might share with you that might be kind of helpful.
And that's so helpful, right? I mean, it when you think of the congregation and the fact that we all didn't come here the same way, and it's really helpful to hear the voices of other people and how the Lord brought them into the faith, and so that you have a much better a much better understanding of the landscape of God's work in the world.
We had a student preach a sermon this spring who had solicited some information from the congregation here, and he shared even kind of an email that he had gotten, and that was really a neat way to give someone in the congregation a voice that speaks in a way that you can't personally speak.
Last week, I did a tangible episode with Dr. David Lewis and Dr. Jim Veltz, and they were talking about digging into the Greek, and they were digging into a certain passage that talked about grace. And Dr. Lewis is like, that's the verse that changed my stepmother's life. And he said he remembers she was sitting in the church and she just started crying when she heard that verse explained. And he's like, and that's the day my stepmother became Lutheran.
See, and that's sometimes those of us who were born and raised in the Lutheran Church. I wonder. I'll just speak personally. I wonder if I appreciate the freedom of the gospel because I don't know an existence under the law like some people do, like the people in Galatia did. And so, getting this perspective, I think, could be a way to help proclaim the freedom that we are free of all, proclaim pure gospel, good news, promise of Jesus, everything. That would be exploring the one side of the paradox. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, if you get that wrong, you lose the gospel.
Right.
And you get legalism, and you get kind of a burden of an existence where you have to feel like you have to please God. And so getting that part of the paradox wrong is really a problem. But then the other flip side, the other part of the paradox, is that we are totally bound. We are totally bound to love and to serve one another. To love and serve the very least, and to make sacrifices, and to give our lives for others. And that's the other half of the paradox that sometimes as Lutherans we get that wrong too, because we want to safeguard the first half of the paradox. So we don't sometimes as preachers, we don't call people to give themselves as servants to all. Or sometimes in our own sinful nature, we think, well, I don't need to serve you. I'm free. I don't need to condescend to you. And so we kind of are in danger of losing this perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all nature of the Christian life. And so I'd want to explore in this part of the sermon the truth and the reality that we are bound to one another, to love one another. It's not always easy. I don't always want to love others. You could probably think of examples, guys, of people you don't really want to love and serve, but you kind of have to because of your vocation, right? And Christians serve all. We do. We don't serve ourselves. And I think some of the reasons we hesitate to proclaim that part of the paradox is we don't want to damage the first part of the paradox. But that's the whole point of a paradox,
right? Is
that you hold them both. They're both true. And that's why I point to Luther's treatise. It's in the American edition of Luther's Works. I would actually suggest, if you've got the American edition of Luther's Works, volume 31, read Luther's On the Freedom of a Christian. And it's I think it will be really helpful. So then, of course, the end of the sermon, right, in this structure is you help people then live in the tension.
Right.
And so you affirm both sides of the paradox, having explored what's potentially wrong if you overemphasize or de-emphasize one of them, and now you send your hearers to live this paradoxical, this freedom conundrum, maybe I'd call it.
Great, thank you, Peter. That's all for today. We have free resources to guide your next step in planning at concordiatheology.org. Peter was talking about it. You can find resources that David has written. You can find videos that David has been in. There are so many awesome resources there, including episodes of Tangible, Theology Learned and Lived, which is the other podcast that I do. If you want to listen to the podcast that I referenced, which was between Dr. David Lewis and Dr. Jim Veltz, it's going to be up pretty soon. Go and check it out. It's at concordiatheology.org. You can find more episodes of Lectionary Kickstart and Tangible also in all the major podcast apps. If you'd like to see the show continue, you can subscribe for free, share, leave a review. I'm your host and producer, Jessica Bordolo. Join us next week at Lectionary Kickstart, when Dr. David Schmidt and Dr. Peter Nafsker will spark your thoughts for next Sunday.
You know, when a baby has a blowout diaper after church, right.
Mm-hmm.